Hi, Rachel.
How are you?
I'm feeling yum yum. That's how I'm feeling. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling a bit yum.
I'm feeling like I went from being called an engineer in the first episode of season 2 to a commander now in this episode of season 2, episode 4. That's right. I'm Ryan, that's Rachel. We're Yum Yum because of the iconic line of dialogue from the iconic character of Nan, who... she's an engineer, now she's a commander who's a security chief, or who knows what she does. But at first, she was introduced as an engineer. Does that come up in this episode? No, it doesn't. And of course, what am I referring to with all this stuff? Well, we are doing our rewatch of Star Trek Discovery. We have seen it when it first initially aired, and it was a very odd experience that we felt would need the rewatch. A rewatch will really redefine our taste and views and experience with this, because after all,
To see if we can get some appreciation, because there are people that enjoy it, and we didn't particularly enjoy it on our first rewatch, but we are seeking to find the good, or to at least understand why we think that it may still be bad.
and with this style of television show, when you're watching it week to week like these ones are introduced, we are looking at little moments in a big show, in a bigger picture, because where does this all lead? So when we are doing our episode-by-episode breakdown, which is what we are doing,
Without trying to have a breakdown
down ourselves, but when we're initially watching it, and we do try to take into consideration when we're doing our rewatch as well, and our discussion of, don't just judge this as an episode, judge this as a part of a larger narrative. Many people have said, "Hey, this is often used for when you say you don't like the show. Hey, you're thinking of it by an episode-by-episode basis. This episode isn't an episode, but a chapter in a large story. And you don't judge a book chapter by chapter. You judge it by how the full story goes. That's the critique often used. So when we were watching it week to week, we're seeing, oh, this episode doesn't make any sense in context. How will that be redefined with the full context of what the actual story is from beginning, middle, and end? This isn't just an episode, Rachel. This is a chapter in a large narrative. So what may seem like a throwaway thing...
We do need to take into account as well that it isn't that all of the series are part of the same book, but each series...
It's like Avatar.
Each season...
is a book of its own.
Is a book, and we are following these characters and along their journey.
But at the same time, there is the following journeys that the first book set into place, the first season.
Yes.
This one follows through, as this episode did in particular.
They are distinct narratives, which we are experiencing over again as we are watching season 3 as it comes out, and that is also its distinct own thing, but they are the same characters, and they are distinctly the characters that have been through the journeys of season 1 and season 2.
Are you okay?
I feel like I have been hit by lightning for the second time this week.
We are discussing for this one, episode 4 of season 2, which comes in at a 7.2 on IMDb, and Obol for Charon. The description for this episode goes as such: a mysterious fear threatens the USS Discovery even as May, in her original form, implements a plan that puts Tilly's life in danger. Saru and Burnham's bond grows when Saru is forced to acknowledge a deeply unsettling Kelpian truth. Pike receives new intel on Spock from a loyal friend. I adore these IMDb descriptions because they always put the emphasis on the wrong things. This made it sound like this is a Tilly episode, right? Or a Paul episode.
Not really.
This is a Saru episode. This is about Saru and Michael. Specifically more so about Saru and his journey and his understanding of things, and the actual important thing there. Like, they made it sound like, oh no, Tilly's life is in danger. Oh, and Saru has to face an unsettling truth. No. The real life in danger,
Wrong
that's the
emphasis.
importance
Just
of this
say it.
episode, is Saru's life
Yep.
is coming to a close, and that's what he is facing towards. Well, she
So-
does not face this life-threatening thing until the last act of the show.
Yeah.
Like, and then by that point, you're like, oh, okay, this is just more drama on top of the situation that's already happening, because at that point, the ship's going to
It's the
explode
stinger,
already,
yeah.
this is going to happen, but from the very beginning, something's wrong with Saru.
Uh-huh.
We find out very quickly what's wrong, and there's an atmosphere that's generated from that. But I just love
Okay,
these
I would
descriptions.
like-
They're very funny.
I would like to take a moment to unpack the title of the episode.
Yeah, go ahead. They love their titles that involve mythology,
Yeah.
faith, spirituality, mythos, that general aura around that, because this is a show about faith. Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek.
Particularly
It's
this
about
season.
faith.
Yeah.
Because
That's the
as
thing.
the writers said at some point, they really wanted to see the clashing of science and spirituality, and that's what we're getting here. We're getting a little bit of that here, and the title, An Obol for Charon.
Yes.
Go ahead, tell us what it is all about.
So I'm just gonna read out what somebody has posted as a trivia point for this episode, which explains the
Mhm.
meaning of the title and the connection to the episode.
So this is on IMDb.
Mhm.
So anyone can have a gander at this and give it a thumbs up for how many people found it of interest and useful.
Interest and helpful. I'll make sure to do that. The title of this episode refers to the ancient practice of placing a coin in the mouth of a dead person before the burial to pay the fare for transportation to the land of the dead. This episode deals strongly with the transition from life to death.
And that is true. This is one of those times in which, although the title is still very pretentious, it actually ties in very neatly with the themes and the journeys that the characters are going on within this episode. Although death is a major component in this episode, I would also say the main theme, the main thing of the episode is communication and understanding one another by listening and using our words, not shooty bang bangs. Death, of course, is very important because it connects to Saru's storyline. That's the one, and the sphere.
It's
But
interesting to see the way that those two are linked, because specifically by saying like an obol for Charon, it's referring to that payment that the living have to make on behalf of the dead.
which Michael is burdened with doing in the episode
for
for
Saru.
Saru
And the ship faces that with
the
sphere.
sphere. Yeah, this episode is the one I was most excited for upon the rewatch value, because to get into our relationship and what we think of the episode, this was my second favorite episode of this season. When I first saw it, I liked this episode. I thought New Eden was better. It had a little less Star Trek Discovery stuff going on, with the multiple things going on at the same time, and the screaming and the terrible jokes and all the stuff that I don't like about Star Trek Discovery was less present in that episode. This one, it's here being full force, and sometimes it actually is beneficial, sometimes it isn't, but when I first saw it, I liked this episode. It had introduced so many great ideas, and I felt like they explored them because they actually had a theme going on, which was, for me, the communication theme. The idea that this entity, this alien being, this object, this sphere, isn't trying to hurt them, but trying to communicate with them. And then down below, that's what's happening with Tilly and her situation. And then, of course, Michael and Saru, their constant roadblock in their friendship is that they don't communicate properly with one another. And that has been set up throughout the show. And Pike needs them to communicate. And then obviously the universal translator is fucking up and communication's being broken down. And it's what happens when getting past the breakdown of communication. And all the stuff going on was building and supporting that idea in this episode. All of these storylines support that idea and feed into that idea or notions of that idea. And I really enjoyed that aspect about this episode the first time round. And I enjoy when something that looks like it's an enemy is actually a benevolent thing trying to do something good. But since it's abstract, since it is alien, we perceive it one way when it's actually the other. That type of story or that type of story beat always hits hard for me, especially in a sci-fi story like a Star Trek episode. And I really liked that when I first saw this episode. However, as we stated before, this isn't just an episode. This feeds into the larger narrative. And as Season 2 proceeded to fly along by and reach its conclusion, I grew suspicious about this episode because I liked it. I saw it as just, this was great. Like, not great, not like the greatest thing ever. The Harry Mudd episode's a great episode in the first season, but this is good. This feels like a good throwback to a Star Trek episode. Great, we got this information from the Sphere. Everything's going to be happy-go-lucky. What I mean by the season goes along is, I didn't realize that the Sphere's information was going to be the entire crux of this season and was going to be the MacGuffin of the season. Our heroes must protect it, and the villain wants it. I didn't realize that that's what this episode was setting up as a story beat. And since this is the setup of that story beat, it made me suspicious of how I was going to feel about it on the rewatch, because when I finished Season 2, that storyline, I hate that storyline. I did not enjoy that storyline. It left me angry, it left me confused. There were things that didn't make sense about it. And most importantly, the villain that wanted this information is this nebulous AI creature that I don't give a shit about. So the setup to that storyline was an episode I liked, but I didn't realize it was a setup to a bigger story. Now, on the rewatch, I was really keen on seeing it because I wanted to see how it stands up on the revisit, because there's multiple things going on when you revisit it. Obviously, does it still stand up as its own episode? But more importantly, how does it feel now knowing that this is the foundation for where the season is truly going to go? Because at first you think, oh, it's the red signals, that's the foundation. No, not really. We haven't heard shit about the red signals in so long. At this point, you kind of forget. Or, oh, we've got to find Spock. This is where the actual conflict is, because we've been saying, why is the red signals important? They just say it's important. They just say, oh, it's important, but we never got an understanding of why it's important. This episode sets up this information that, if given into the wrong hands, could lead to destruction. So when revisiting it, I can actually see why this is important in terms of we don't want a villain to get this because it has 100,000 years of information built up. But the red signals, we're rewatching it and I still don't understand what the stakes are with that storyline. Why does Pike need to be in charge? Why do they have to force Stamets into the spore drive to go to the red signals? None of that makes sense. But on a rewatch, this actually makes sense to me. Did I enjoy it on this one? Mixed bag. It's a real mixed bag. What was your relationship with this episode when you first saw it, and how's it for you now?
I found it pretty ridiculous the first time, and I still find it very ridiculous. This episode was one of the ones where my notes just ended up being quotes that stood out as being like, you fucking what?
But when you first saw it, you felt it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And you still feel that way now.
Yeah.
Is it more or less ridiculous knowing how the story plays out in the singular episode and in the larger narrative?
Oh, yeah, it becomes grading on a curve, and I know that it gets worse, so I don't find it as ridiculous. But I will give it credit that the ridiculous matches, like the tone has been set and they follow through on that. It's just that I don't appreciate that particular quality in this show.
So you're not a fan of this episode, is the general gist of the thing.
I had fun making fun at it, but I do not think that it's a good episode particularly.
And you never did.
No, I like the idea of the plot. I just don't like the way that it's executed.
Yeah, that is... It is just... Star Trek Discovery has a way of executing ideas that on paper seem good, right? Like when you hear us describe what the plot beats are and the ideas, they sound coherent and they sound like you could reap a lot from them. But Star Trek Discovery's execution leaves a lot to be desired, at least for us. And again, this is our thoughts. We're not saying these are objective facts, but these are our opinions. And it's because multiple factors. The big one being it rushes through everything. Everything's rushed through. There's a bit in this episode where Tilly gets drilled and they drill into her skull to implant this thing into her so that they can speak to a parasite. And that's just one minor note in the episode when that could have been a whole episode beat. Like, that's just a minor inconvenience in that B story. That's just a minor thing in that B story. And that's what I mean. That's what I mean it feels rushed through. That's a whole episode. Saru and the sphere stuff, I didn't feel like that was rushed through in the same way because I feel like it played out in its natural beats, and the connection between the sphere and Saru I thought was done neatly considering what Star Trek Discovery's storytelling style is. But there's just so many moments in which I just sit there and I scratch my head and I went, that just happened. And it just breezes on by. And I just was like, this is crazy. But that's its way of delivering and executing these ideas and stories. And I'm getting to that point where I'm becoming truly nihilistic about the fact, because I'm watching this episode and Doug Jones is nailing it. Saru's nailing it as a character as well, and these themes and all this. And I'm just sitting there, and I since I know how it's going to play out, and I know what they're going to do with his character, and what they're not going to do with his character too. And since I also know where the next season is going with stuff, which we're not going to get into, but there's this overwhelming sense of none of this really matters, because at the end of the season they're going to leap into the future and reset everything. All of this stuff that's happening right here and now, when you're rewatching it, at least for me, I'm getting to this point where I'm like, none of this matters. Like, remember when this was a show about the Klingon War? And that just stopped because they ran out of ideas of what to do with it and they didn't know what to do with it, so it just stopped. Remember when Saru's entire character was built on his sense of fear and death? Well, here it is now that's stopped because they had nothing else to do with it. Like, this is how nihilistic I'm getting. Like, I know there's points we can talk about of why they've chosen to wrap up that element of his character, and they're evolving his character into this, but there's just this element of me where I'm just looking at it going, none of this matters, truly. And since this is a serialized story, and since this isn't like old Star Trek where you begin an episode and you finish it and then none of that episode matters, this hurts more because it is a serialized story, because they're trying to tell it in this modern prestige television way in which we're having expectations of it that are different from the expectations you get from something like the original series or Next Generation. I look at this and I feel like this is truly pointless in a way, because I'm watching Saru worry about this whole entire affair, and I just remember, in a singular episode, they overthrow the predator species on his planet, install his species as the dominant race, and then they fly spaceships in a matter of a week. Like, when that could have been a whole season or two long storyline. But that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at. When I watch this episode, and episodes like this, I can't help but think of how futile it feels, especially because I know that all this leads to them jumping into the future so that everything that we've set up here, this universe of Star Trek, is just erased off the board so that they can start again.
I think the audience has to have a satisfying experience of the season. I think they have to feel it's come full circle and that they've had an arc. So I think we can have an arc, and we can also set up where we want to go next season. Those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive.
What did you get out of this episode? What did you get out of it? What did you receive from it?
I don't know, because I feel like there was something, but I don't know how to quantify it or explain it.
Well, can you even scratch at what that something is? Because to me, this episode is clearly trying to say stuff. Like I've said, it's connecting this element and that element and this element, but at the same time, there's just, to me, so much fucking garbage and noise on top of it that I struggle to really say what I got out of this episode, other than Doug Jones was good. I like Saru. Yeah. It was nice that the show centered an episode on a character that I think everyone likes, right? I think most people enjoy Saru. Yes. I think he is, in the world of Star Trek Discovery, the fan favorite. And it's great that they focus on him. And it shows you that he's like the only competent fucking character in their crew, really, without having to declare that he's a genius at every stage or making jokey quips. He just does things. Yeah. Like, he has jokes and quips and all that. I'm not denying that. But, like, he just does things efficiently. Yeah. He doesn't need to be Stamets where he's high-fiving and everyone's clapping and he's making quips and jabs, and he's not Tilly who's fucking talking all the time about how smart she is and how kooky and weird she is, and he's not Michael who's crying over their brilliance and their tragedy at every single. He's fucking dying in this episode, and he did not cry.
No,
but Michael cried for him, so there's the tears of the episode. Not a single tear.
No. Yeah. Okay. So when you ask me what did I get out of the episode, are you talking about like what I think the message is, or what did I enjoy, or...
It's an open question, really. When I sit down... Okay, I'll put it like this. When I sit down and watch an episode of any TV show, but since we're a Star Trek show, let's talk about Star Trek. When I sit down and I watch an episode of Star Trek, and I'll choose a random one to pick, right? Like, when I sit down and watch an episode about Lwaxana Troi, for instance, I after watching it, I have a feeling after it. Like, that was sad. I walk away with a sense of sorrow. Or, that was funny. I walk away with something.
I feel nothing.
Or...
in that sense.
Makes you think of something like Lwaxana Troi had to deal with, well, ritual suicidal culture who kills their people off at a certain age. And that episode dealt with death. It dealt with acceptance of death. It dealt with coming to terms with age. And these are things I got out of the episode, right? Mm-hmm. These are things I got out of the episode. These are things I walk away with, as well as just basically that made me feel something. What do you get out of this? Do you get themes? Do you get feelings? Do you get ideas? Like, what do you get out of this episode? Because you are far more negative than I am. Yeah. And I'm being very negative right now.
Here's where I'm at today with it. This episode had themes. I can understand that it had themes and it explored them. And I can note the positives and the negatives with that. When the episode finished, it didn't leave me thinking anything or feeling anything about the episode. I not even like laughing at the ludicrous lines.
Yeah.
And I was just like, yeah, that happened. That like it left me with nothing.
And why is that the case? And especially for this episode, which again, we have disagreed about since we've first seen it.
Yeah.
I always defend this episode, or have at least explained the merits that I have seen in it,
And
which I have touched upon already, but you
I do see merits in it.
but you don't get those merits,
But
and that's something that
no,
fascinates me.
That's not something that I take on board. And I think a part of it, at least, is the fact that I think the messaging is inconsistent. Because, like, we see, like, the implicit messaging makes the themes feel muddled. It doesn't end up having that sense of being pulled together, because all of the storylines are technically all about death and all about consequences
And communication.
and communication, and the consequences of not communicating effectively, and the test that has on us as people and our relationships.
Yeah.
And I can see that. I can see what they were going for. But why it doesn't have any sense of sticking to me or lingering with anything, because the message that underlies each of those storylines isn't consistent. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be consistent to make it meaningful, but it's not contrasting enough. So it just feels like they've gone with this idea, but they haven't fully grappled with it. They think that they're doing something metaphysical and philosophical.
Oh, well, we don't have
with it.
time to talk about the metaphysical implications of that, Rachel. We just don't have time.
But that is what to me, they think that they're doing that, but they haven't actually done any of the work or thought behind things. So all of these lines that like the music says and the acting say is like, wow, we're being so meaningful and this is so deep and you emotionally wrought.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, no, because you haven't done any actual groundwork. This feels like a first draft. This feels like a first take a lot of the time. It doesn't feel like it's embodied by anything.
Michael's acting felt like a first take in most of the scenes in this episode. But before you go off that train of thought, could you give us examples of the things within the actual episode that you're referring to? Because what you're saying is, I understand what you're saying, but you could just describe that as the general feel. But give us the details of examples and things within the episodes that fall into what you're saying. Because again, I've struggled to see your point of view with this episode in the past when I had not rewatched this, and also that you had these kind of feelings before we reached the conclusion of these storylines. That's where my main struggle is with the rewatch of this episode, is how this one is in a different context now with where the season ends.
Yeah.
But give us some examples of things in the actual episode that make you feel this way.
It boils down to that I feel like the show just keeps on telling me, not showing me.
Mm-hmm.
And I will just go through some of the lines that I wrote down that I feel
demonstrate
reflect
this.
that feel hollow to me. The first one that I wrote down was when Pike says, "My abiding trust doesn't eclipse the mission at hand."
Yes.
So he's saying that he has unbiding trust in Burnham.
But why?
But why? She hasn't proven that. And also,
she's held back from him several times in moments where it's been important. And I'm not...
She chooses to hold back, or she decides not to disclose information. So then it doesn't ring true to me that he would have abiding trust in her. And to me, that relies too much on the audience understanding that he has a trust for Spock, and because she's
Spock's
his
sister.
sister, that there is a link and a trust.
Yeah.
And that's not the way that trust usually works.
Well, I think too, one of the things that I'll say with that is, I disagree on one minor level, is I believe that Pike believes that. Not just because of Anson Mount's performance, but I think Pike is an empathetic, feeling character. The problem that I have with that is we, the audience, don't feel that way.
I agree.
We ourselves, us two, don't feel that way about Michael. We roll our eyes. We get annoyed when Michael withholds information. So when a character says, like, Michael, you're the best, or Michael, I love you, or Michael, I trust you, these things that we don't necessarily feel the same about Michael, or we don't feel the show has demonstrated about Michael, that's where the issue comes in for myself, because I agree, that line he says felt really odd, and it's not because character-wise it doesn't make sense for him, it's because in the context of the show, it doesn't make sense for us, because I've seen Michael fuck up time and time again, or withhold information, or do these weird character choices because of her trauma with Spock, and I get frustrated with her, but since Pike's okay with it, then I should be okay with it, and I not
feel
fully.
Like they haven't done the groundwork. Like Ensign Mount sells that line and he sells that moment. And in the instant when he says it, I'm like, yeah, you do. And then when I think about it, I'm like, but you shouldn't. Because it also just neglects, because the show does this as well overall, which is, well, she's had her record expunged. She's no longer a mutineer, even though she committed the mutiny. So she's been forgiven by Starfleet, so nobody will use that as a reason to distrust her anymore. But it still is a reason to distrust her, because you know that she is capable of mutiny, of doing what she
was,
thinks.
but now she's got principles.
But she still,
because of the first season,
she still shows those same leaps in logic that she did that led her to mutiny.
But now it's for good because she has principles.
Yeah, it's only the last step that she doesn't take anymore. So it's just like, those are reasons to distrust her, because it's still insubordination. She's still committing acts of insubordination left, right, and center throughout this season, and as well as what we've seen at the start of season 3 as well.
But is it okay with this whole train of thought? And I know you're gonna have quotes from other characters, I'm sure, but is it because a lot of this falls into that what you were saying because of the character of Michael Burnham? Is that the reason? Because we don't like Michael very much. We feel that the writers love her. She's right, because the show is always taken from the position that Michael's right, and that often makes it hard when you have ethical dilemmas and moral dilemmas and issues, because it makes the other characters feel diminished. Saru, this is his episode, yet the episode still frames it around Michael. Saru's fucking dying. He's coming to terms with his culture's been a lie. All this stuff, but it's still about Michael
dealing with the loss and her next loss, and she's lost so many people. How can she deal with losing any more?
But is it because...
And that isn't an idea that has been played out so much better in other pieces of media. So it just makes it feel even more vacuous because of my personal context, having engaged with other texts that do that same idea.
And because this is an ensemble show, it's clear that this is an ensemble show.
In a way where it actually matters.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter in this one. And it doesn't reflect on anything. It's within that line and within that scene. But because Saru doesn't die, it doesn't have any further impact.
Well,
it doesn't like re-engage those feelings of concern or like her being anxious or avoiding those opportunities for loss. She just is like, okay, well, Saru's fine now. I'm fine. Everything's
Well,
okay.
no, because here's the thing. Okay, so
I mean,
because
Michael
she
seems
has
to be
to
acting that way.
because now she has to pursue Spock because she promised
Yeah.
Saru, and that's what the push is. But is this whole dilemma because of our central character of Michael? These things fall flat. These things fall hollow. When characters say these lines and these feelings and these sentiments, is it because they're always directed about Michael, or is it a bigger systemic issue?
I think
Because
it's a bigger systemic issue, but most of the examples are around Burnham because the show, though it is ensemble, it places Burnham at, she is the sun of the universe of Star Trek Discovery.
oh, no, you could have just said Star Trek, because that's what this season's about.
Yeah,
Her
that's true.
being the reason why Spock is Spock.
Yeah.
Her being the reason why Sarek is Sarek. Her being the reason why
Everything.
Amanda's Amanda. And then Spock makes Jim, and Jim makes Bones, and that means it's all because of Michael.
Yes.
She's a son of Star Trek. She's the most important
Mm-hmm.
character that has ever existed in this universe outside of, like, Jonathan Archer, practically, because at least Archer was there at the fucking formation of the
Yeah.
whole entire affair. Like, if she had the opportunity, she would travel back in time and kick him in the nads, and then she would start the Federation. But I just wanted to ask that because it's obvious that we don't like Michael, and people who love this show take it as a bigger kind of toxic statement to say you don't like Michael Burnham. There's obviously heavy implications that fall into that. You're either a sexist or a racist or so on and so forth, or you don't like this type of character but you like it in this other piece of media, then why is that the case? And I just wanted to make sure that we actually talk about that, because also I question, would all of these problems be less for me if Michael was removed? And I don't think
or
so, because
if Michael was tweaked in some way. But no, like, these feel like they're cracks, and it feels like they would be there no matter
because
if you
I
took
feel
Michael out of it or not.
because Michael was surprisingly my least the least of my concerns in this episode. Tilly, Paul, and Jet Reno bugged me the fuck more than Michael did in this one.
Weird dream. I was playing drums for Prince, and there were doves and a bray.
Okie doke.
Those three down there doing the fuck whatever they were doing annoyed me far greater, and I just wanted to kind of point that out too, of like, there's issues with those characters that still fall into this line, because there's just these moments where it's like, Paul and Jet Reno, like, Jet's this amazing character. It's like we haven't seen her in 3 episodes, and she just walks in, like, hey, it's Tig Notaro. It's like, fucking, I don't know her.
Yeah. So the next line that I have is from Tig,
Classic Tig.
which is, "You don't know me, but I'm uninsultable."
Okay, can we talk about that? One of the things that takes me out, and we haven't really talked about this because it hasn't been super prevalent, but it becomes more so, is the way people talk in a very modern context.
Yeah.
They don't feel like they're from the future. They feel like they're from 2017, 2018. They feel like Tig Notaro sounds like Tig Notaro.
Yep.
She doesn't sound like a character from the future who's a grumpy, smart aleck. She sounds like a woman from our current time, just she says technobabble words.
Yeah. That does happen, and I also have a bit of an issue when characters speak as if they're having a revelation in therapy. Which happens with Tilly when she's just like, "I've been thinking about why did it choose to come to me as May, and what did
You
I
think of it as
do?"
therapy. I think of it as spiritual awakening, because it's all like. But I get we haven't really talked about it because yes, it's been there when they swear and stuff, sure, but there's just so many moments that's already been happening, like Tilly especially, but this episode is filled with each character just has a moment in which they say something that doesn't feel like it's from this time. It's not even the words, it's the way that they're said. Like Tig Notaro says at one point, I think about Michael's like, oh, I figured it out, I've got to go. And then Tig Notaro says something like, damn, woman! And she says it like that. And I'm taken out of it because this doesn't feel like its own universe, a sci-fi universe with its own vernacular. It sounds like people wearing costumes on a set.
Yeah,
and they thought it was really funny that Tig Notaro would go, yeah, go, damn, woman! Or Tilly in a previous episode being like, thang! And it feels very now. It feels very now in a distracting manner, while something like the TNG, they'll have an episode where they introduce the Cardassians, and it felt very current politics. But that's the thing, politics. Picard wasn't sounding like he was from 1991 in that episode, with his voice and his vernacular and his words, but the politics are very of that time, and that's because it's a show about politics in a lot of ways. And the great thing about exploring political things in your show is decades later, that can still ring true. Because it's
the same power dynamics being played out in a different context. And because they've removed the specifics to explore the underlying issues and the way that makes us human, or the way that humans interact, it becomes closer to a universal theme and an exploration of something fundamental. But our problem is that we don't see that happening in Star Trek Discovery. They aren't doing the deeper work. They feel more like they are just doing the facade of things and putting a sticker on it, rather than actually dealing with and diving down and digging into anything. And it becomes more obvious with an episode like this, because it's dealing with death, which is something that ultimately every human being ends up being faced with.
Yeah. But then you get taken out of it when it's supposed to be in this sci-fi world that's different to our own. They speak so randomly. It's at random points too. It's not if it was consistently through. But it feels like, you remember how in Star Trek Voyager they have an episode where they travel back in time to go to the 1990s because Ed Begley Jr. has technology he shouldn't have. And it feels weird and alien because they go back to 1990s and they are met with a completely different society with a different way of operating. And we have Sarah Silverman's character, and she's 1990s Sarah Silverman up to the nth degree. She's got the quirkyism. She's the romantic interest, but she also is speaking the technobabble because she's a nerd. Could you imagine if Voyager, every single character spoke like her character at least 3 times in one episode sporadically? It would be weird, right? And you'd go, okay,
I don't want to think about
and you
that.
go, what's the rules? What's the etiquette? What's the behavior of these characters and of the universe that these characters live in? And that is what happens in an episode like this. I know it's such a very minor thing to point out, but I've been noticing it more and more and more. Especially as newer Star Treks, Picard especially, and the 3rd season of Star Trek Discovery, characters just speak like they're actors now, and not as the characters and the world that these ones inhabit. And you have moments like that where it's like, where they high five and they say, fuck yeah, I love science, and it feels artificial, and that detracts from the enjoyment of an episode because it feels wrong.
Well, damn, woman, go.
There's a little thing here that, and I don't know if you're going to agree with me or not, but when a moment like this happens, there's a little part of my brain right at the stem that kind of warms up in a way because it's trying to make sense of something there. Because I know for a fact that Saru's people, when the ganglia fall off and they go through this, they physically evolve and they get the spikes that shoot out stuff. And my brain warms up a little bit because I know that's the case. But Saru says for those who don't die from the culling and they get this, they just go mad. And I go, but Saru didn't go mad in this. And my brain just starts fritzing out because I go, so why did the others go mad and not just evolve like he does with no qualms? And then I think, wait, so if this is a biological part of their evolution, why is it that when they go through this change at random points in life, it's not as if it's like from childhood to teenage years, we go through puberty. Like you may go through puberty earlier, I may go through it later, but usually, consistency-wise, humanity as a species goes through it at a roughly around this period of a human lifespan. But with his race, it seems it's loosey-goosey. Fine. But my brain tries to then make sense of, wait, so biologically speaking, why does the ganglia fall off and then it makes most of them crazy to the point in which they can't function and they die or they're socially rejected, and then the others like Saru once in a lifetime doesn't go crazy and he evolves to what they're supposed to be. Why is that?
So
because he says it's hardwired into their DNA.
Yeah, I didn't think about it in that way. What?
Because you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to think about it like that.
So I filled in the gaps in a different way so that it didn't lead me to questioning in that way.
Mm-hmm.
The way that I thought about it, sorry, I'm just laughing at myself now because it's just like I'm going through all of these things of where I'm like not giving them credit even though they're trying. And I've realized that I've probably made a leap where they actually weren't trying at all.
Did you make a quantum leap? Put
I'm
once went wrong?
Possibly. Let's see how this goes. So, obviously, like we see it retrospectively because we know what happens on Saru's planet.
And with him.
So the first option of dying by the Great Balance and the Bowel coming and killing you.
Yeah, because they don't want them to be super predators.
Yes,
so
because
they
are the
you.
threat. They have become a threat. So the Bowel will kill them now because it's easier to keep the population in check than to try and exterminate them all. And obviously, like, the Bowel will get the resources that the Kelpians develop.
Yes.
So there is that. Then I think I took it as all Kelpians are capable of succeeding through the process.
Well, yeah.
That it doesn't necessarily make them go mad, not the actual process, but it's their inability to understand what they are going through and the changes because they are losing everything that they thought to be true and see as being Kelpian. So because they do not have the tools to understand what is going on and they are then rejected by their society, that drives them mad because the Kelpians wouldn't be able to understand that you do not have fear and that is power.
You know,
because the Kelpians do not do that.
What you're saying is compelling, and I can see it being that way. I can see it being that way. I don't, because my brain can't help but remember the tricks of the trade that this show uses. Remember 2 episodes ago that we made a big song and dance about how they just put stamets in the spore drive because they needed to get to that mystery box. This is the exact same thing for me because they need this to happen in this way. So just don't think about it fully this way. Like for instance, obviously the Barul can't control all of his species and cull them all before they have this development, right? But then your question would be, because logically it would be hard to do that, right? So then your logically would go, well, if they're supposed to be the predator species and they evolve and they have the upper hand physically, wouldn't there be at least one person in their species that would have evolved and got to the process and where Saru is at? Why is that? Oh, just say that they go mad. Just say that they go mad, and that's why no one's ever seen someone who's evolved to this level before. And that's what I mean. It's just like, don't think about it until we get to that storyline where Saru's the savior figure and Saru shows them what's right. And it makes me go crazy because I'm trying to think. And that's what I mean. When I watch a scene like that and he says that line and they all go mad, I think about the logistics of how that works in the universe of the show. I'm thinking about the history of his planet and of his species, and I'm going, wait, wouldn't there have been one other person? Wouldn't there be several people like Saru who evolved to the point and show them that, wait, this is the way? And sure, you could have the cultural rejection and stuff you're saying, but he makes it out like you go mad. You either you get killed or you go insane, and then this happens, and it doesn't happen that way, and it just doesn't make any sense to me when I watch it. And so a moment like this is lessened for me on the rewatch because I know it doesn't make sense to me. And what you said is compelling, but I don't remember that Barul storyline that they have later with his people play it out like that.
No, and I don't think they do. That's why I tried to kind of preface that with saying that I've filled that in because I've done that. The show hasn't done that. That's the assumption and the leap that I've made that makes, that stitches those two things together a lot tighter than it did for you. Because you didn't make that leap. You didn't put that in place. But my mind automatically did that, so I don't question it as much. And now that you've said that, I can't see it any other way.
Because, as we've established, they cut corners in their story. Did you notice? Okay, for instance, again, Paul and Spore Drive. We've already gone over that. We don't need to go over that again. This episode, the entire ship is fucked because the translator's fucked up, right? So no one can communicate properly. No one can read their equipment properly because the universal translator's all fucky.
Yeah, there's a virus that's infected the ship that's been sent from it, and then they develop digital antibodies.
But that doesn't work. That doesn't work.
It's
sluggish. Works. It's sluggish, but it doesn't fully work for the ship, and it's not. And they don't need.
Bring that up as another example of where they've just thrown a phrase out.
It doesn't matter. We got to move on. In the episode, they show Saru painfully being the one who can solve this situation because he's the only one who knows multiple languages, so 94. This doesn't affect him as strongly. So he shows us, ding, 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 I've solved the bridge, I've solved this area. He has to physically go from place to place to solve the issue. This is a ship-wide issue. It's spreading to all these places, and you're hearing that it's spreading to here, 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 and you're getting this idea that this is going to spread quickly. Saru needs to work quickly, but he's dying, and this. Conveniently, because the plot needs to happen, the Spore Drive area is the only other area that's not affected. It's just surprisingly not affected. Why? Because we need this story to happen. No, they just say like, oh, it's like, locked off. We just didn't happen.
That's how they do it. They say things and then they do.
But that's what I mean.
The lightning rod thing, and it's just like this doesn't mean anything. You are clearly working backwards.
And that's it. It's reverse engineering. But that's the point I'm making is I don't have faith because they cut corners like this. Instead of following the problem all the way to its bitter end, of having Saru have to come down there and fix the problem, they have it just that the problem doesn't happen there by convenience. Because we need the story to happen. We
Even though
need
they
it to
keep
happen.
on bringing up how life support is failing on other parts of the ship.
And not just the
But
life
we
support,
don't
just the
even get
universal
to see
translator
that.
thing doesn't even affect them down there
No, it
because
doesn't.
if it
None
did,
of
it would
it
be
matters.
inconveniencing to their story. It would slow down the pace. It would put more
We
time on
don't-
Saru and not enough time on Tilly. So how do we get
Also-
around this problem that we've created? Oh, just say it hasn't affected us.
Run a full diagnostic, Captain, and this section remains unaffected by the virus. We'll update you if anything changes.
Thank you, Ensign.
Do you remember how this episode begins? Remember, this is an episode about Saru, but how does the episode begin?
It's a staff meeting, isn't it?
No.
That's not the first thing?
No. How does the episode begin? How does this episode begin? What is this beginning of this episode that ties in with what the episode's about? What's the beginning of this episode?
I don't remember.
Who's introduced in the beginning of the episode? Who transports upon the ship in the beginning of the
number
episode?
one.
What was that? That whole entire scene is there to just remind us about Spock and number one exists. But really, what did that scene serve to anything in the story? It just is so jarring because characters just come into the show and say, I'm in the show now, and then they just leave. There's a moment where Nan, who's been in the show from episode 1, has to say her name because the show realizes they've never said her name till now. And like I said, they introduce her as an engineer. Now she's just a commander, and you assume by her demeanor that she's a security officer. But they've already said that she's an engineer. So does she help out in engineering at any point? No, she just stands on the deck. Because don't think about what we said before. We're moving on. But that beginning scene, really, there was a disconnect for me.
This pawn may look like a pawn, but it's actually a rook.
That beginning scene left me cold. Pike's charming. Number one's charming. She's eating burgers, having a shake, whatever. What I was really
They
dumb
do a good job at like livening that up because it's mostly exposition, but
But
they're playing with that relationship nicely.
I had a disconnect from that scene because although these characters are here and these are played by new actors and they're talking about Spock, who's going to be played by Ethan Peck, and these are all characters that are being redefined and recontextualized because of Star Trek Discovery, I couldn't help but look at this scene and realize I'm watching a scene of two characters talking about another character, all of which are not from this show. And I realized I didn't care. It's as if you watched... could you imagine if Next Generation... Seriously. Could you imagine if Next Generation, its opener, its cold open sting, was two characters from the original series talking about Chekhov? And then Chekhov doesn't even show up in the fucking episode? And then one of the characters that is talking that scene leaves. Like, it's great to have them. But do you feel what I mean? I'm sitting here watching two characters who, yes, they exist because this show exists, but they really exist because they're from an unaired pilot from the 1960s, talking about a character from Star Trek, the original series. And I'm realizing, why is this even here? I'm watching two characters talk about another character, all three of which aren't from this show and will not matter after this season. What does any of this fucking matter? And that's when my nihilism comes in as well, where I'm watching this and I'm going, I don't fucking care. Go to Saru. This is Saru's episode. And when it's actually on Saru and he's talking about his culture and he's talking about his people and he's talking about death and accepting it and he's talking about Michael and his friendship with Michael or lack of friendship, I feel something there because guess what? He's from this show.
But
he's from this
it was
show.
only in that moment that Saru and Bernard both realized. I realize now that you are my family.
I realize now that you are my family, Saru.
I feel the same about you. You are the only one who knows me. You replaced the sister I had on Kaminar.
I asked earlier what you got from this episode, and that was a struggle for you.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand theory-wise what this B story is offering outside of the larger narrative. But I struggle so hard to get anything from this story in the actual watching of it. Every time it cut back to them and Jet Reno's being like, I'm a character, and she's making quips, and Stamets is doing this, and they get high, and May's explaining, oh, let's do this. I just shut off.
Have you always been a superior being?
I just shut off because it doesn't connect with me. I don't care. I don't give a single shit about what they're doing. But why is that? Because it does tie in thematically. It has poignancy. It furthers the dramatic stakes that are happening within the episode because things bad happening down here, things are going good up there, right? Like, it structurally makes sense in the script, but I just don't give a rat's ass about what's happening to them.
I just also need to point out that our language is getting, like, simpler and simpler. Like, it bad.
It bad.
It bad. Bad thing happening down there, up there, good. Like, that's at the stage that we're at.
I get nothing out of their story. Do you get anything out of it? Like, what, when you see that story pop on, did you get
and if anything,
any enjoyment?
I will say this, and I am sure you will add your own, but it makes it even worse when they bring David Bowie into it.
I love David Bowie. I love David Bowie. And fucking hearing Tilly's shrill-ass voice singing David Bowie while she's getting a drill into her fucking skull. I hate the scene so much. It makes me cringe.
Yep, I hate it too. And it just, like, it's
embarrassing.
It's just another nail in the coffin of that plot for me as well.
And this is us being petty. This is a petty thing.
Yeah, it's absolutely petty.
But it's
absolutely a gripe, and it's not an issue with the show at all. It's an issue with our connection to the show because of who we are and our context. That is it. But that is important for how we see the show and how we evaluate it.
Yeah.
Which is what we are doing. We are conversing about how we feel about the show on the rewatch. That's the purpose of this podcast.
When you see this storyline pop up, the most interesting thing to come out of it is the revelation that their jumps are hurting the mycelial network, and a creature from the mycelial network has managed to get out of their world to come to ours to tell us what's going on. That is the most fascinating idea. That's a genuinely great idea. That's an awesome idea. I think that is such a great way to approach this spore drive issue, because obviously one of the things that Star Trek Discovery has going against it is it's a prequel. So the idea of introducing this legendary piece of technology, you know that they're going to have to get rid of it. They're going to have to explain why this doesn't exist, because Star Trek Voyager exists, right? Star Trek Voyager is about trying to get home. And you're telling me that no one in Star Trek Voyager could have figured out about this spore technology? Okay, it doesn't make sense, right? So they have to explain it. So this is a great way of doing that, of it causes massive amounts of unforeseen environmental damage. Awesome. Great. I don't like the execution of it, but great. But then, and again, maybe this rewatch will tell us otherwise, it's revealed in my recollection that they're not actually the ones hurting it. It's Hugh inside of there that's hurting them. So that's why they're allowed to keep doing their jumps later in the show. Yeah. So when this comes up, all I see is this big, great idea just as a wet fish just flop on the table and stink up the room because it doesn't matter.
You came for help to rid your species of the destructive alien presence?
You are the destructive alien presence.
The jumps?
Discovery's jumps?
The biggest issue I have with this episode on the rewatch, the hugest one, and it's a damning one.
Yes.
It almost breaks the show.
Uh-huh.
They end Saru's character here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what it is with Star Trek Discovery. In a way, it's almost as if it's saying genetic manipulation. It does feel like it has a weird relationship with eugenics and or physical perfection, because characters go through literal instant character change and development by physical change. Stamets physically alters himself via manipulating with his genetic code, and he changes as a character. He used to be this cold, stern guy, but now he's quirky old Stamets who we know, because he physically evolved. And that's what happens to Saru. And Saru had the best setup to me in the whole entire show, because he was the typical Star Trek character. He was the Doctor. He was Data. He was Spock, the inhuman / non-human / alien creature who's going to go on the journey of understanding what humanity is, whether they're willing to from the beginning or they're curious to or not. That's a character type that's in all of Star Trek. Every single one has a character like that, and Saru was that. And they start off with an interesting place with him because he's motivated by fear. And that's so great. And he's also the Star Trek character. He's the Starfleet guy who's like, he tries to find meaning in the regulations to define him. And his fear and his insecurities were a defining trait of his character. And now that ends here, because he has physically evolved into a new character. And then Hugh will come back next episode, and he's going to physically evolve into a new character. And I don't know why they do this constantly in the show. Why do they think that evolution or development of a character means a physical reset? And to me, this is the most damning, because I don't give a shit about Hugh. I don't give a shit about Paul. I do give a shit about Saru. And he is less interesting from this point on. And I still like him as a character, but the thing that they said his character was is instantly turned off. It's not as if it's like the Doctor from Voyager, where this is where the Doctor is, and by season 3, you notice that that's no longer what he is, because he's slowly developed. This isn't an arc. This is a reset.
Flips a switch.
In Star Trek Next Gen, they had the emotion chip thing, right, with Data. They purposely didn't give him that emotion chip in the show for the longest time, and then the movies happen, and the movies are the movies. But could you imagine if Data got that emotion chip in season 3 and carried on with it for the rest of the show? He wouldn't be as interesting. Because the thing that we like about Data, the thing that made Data that character, would be gone. It would be removed. It would be uninstalled in him. And that's what Saru has. And to me, it's irredeemable about this show.
Because I've gone through Viharai now. I'm not living in fear every day again, as was programmed into my species. There's a transition I went through in season 2 where I broke free from that. So now that's been liberating, and he now can be in a position of leadership confidently. That changes everything.
I give this episode a yum. There's no point in doing a Hugh-da. They don't even mention him at any point. There's nothing to learn.
No.
Hugh-da, they still refuse to use a sickbay, and every time they do, they just show it to be incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
What's that about? Again, I don't understand the priority of Star Trek Discovery when it comes to medicine and physical treatments of things. Because it always seems like medicine is dumb in this show. Like, medicine's like, why would you even try medicine as an option? Is always a thing. It's always like science and engineering are the obvious way, but medical science, that's for dum-dums. I don't know what that's about.
I give this either. Yum.
We both give it a yum. A resounding yum.
Tell us all about Saints of Imperfection.
This is also the lowest rated episode. It's equal with the Point of Light. This comes in at a 6.5. This is Burnham and the crew navigate a dangerous alien landscape in a race against time to save Tilly's life, but Stamets is not at all prepared for what they find in the process. Section 31 is assigned to help track down Spock, much to Pike's dismay. This is the one where Hugh comes back.
Yep.
That's this episode. So make sure to check out that episode in the interim so you're up to date with what we're going to be discussing, or at least read up on it, or if you're already familiar with it, then come back next episode when we talk about it, because that one will be... The whole episode will be a Hugh-dar.
Yep. And if
I think that's how we're going to operate with that one. We're just going to open up with the Hugh-dar instead of our theme song and just be like, this is no longer the YumYumPod, it's the Hugh-dar pod.
Okay.
Because that episode's all about Hugh.
I'll deal with that. If you would like to hear more of us, you can consider going on over to our Patreon, where we have a few exclusive shows over there, Star Trek related and not. And you, as always, you can check us out on the various social medias at YumYumPod, or shoot us an email at yumyumpod@gmail.com.
Yeah, hit us up on those socials or email us. Let us know your thoughts, opinions, questions, concerns, and all that kind of stuff relating to the episodes or Star Trek Discovery or things that we've said or all that great stuff. A pleasure as always talking to you, Rachel. I will say, when we started this, I was feeling very low energy. But looking at you, hearing what you have to say, and you looking at me, hearing what I have to say, I'm energized now. I feel yum yum.